I still don't know what I'm calling this series though.
Morbid Morsels.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. Hi everyone, I'm Lizzie and this is the very first episode of Morbid Morsels. So this is a series where I am going to be eating the last meals of famous criminals, and as I'm eating the meal, I'm going to talk about their life and the crimes they committed and everything like that. I'm very excited to kick off this series. Today we are doing Ted Bundy. He is an American serial killer and he has a crazy story that we're going to talk about today. I figured he was going to be a fitting first person to cover, and his last meal wasn't too terribly crazy because some of these people went like really overboard with their last meal, and I'm kind of afraid for what I'm getting myself into. If you guys end up liking this video and you want to see more, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know what you think, if you have any suggestions on criminals that you want me to cover, and anything in between. So for Ted Bundy's last meal, I read that he was offered this meal, but that he did not necessarily eat it. So we're kind of cheating, but I'm gonna eat it anyways, and because I wanted to talk about Ted Bundy because he's crazy. So Ted Bundy's last meal consisted of a steak, medium rare, 2 eggs over easy, some toast with butter and jelly, some hash browns, and he had orange juice, not orange juice specifically, but he had juice, hot coffee, and milk. So that is what I have today. I picked it up from Waffle House. Not sponsored, but if Waffle House wants to sponsor me, that'd be awesome. And normally I do eat pescatarian, which means I don't eat red meat or chicken or pork or anything. I just eat fish, and then otherwise I'm vegetarian. But I'm going to break that for this series, and I'm starting off with a T-bone steak, so I'm a little intimidated, but we're gonna go ahead and dive in. I'm gonna go ahead and try the steak first to see how it is. Ted Bundy was born November 24th, 1946 in Burlington, Vermont. I don't even know like what part of a T-bone you eat and what you don't eat, but
Don't eat the bones.
thank you. That's not too bad. I don't think anyone really knows who his real father was. From my research, I saw that his mother, Eleanor, listed his father as several different people. So I think it kind of varies depending on what source you look at. So his father is unknown. He wasn't really in the picture. Ted was raised in Philadelphia, and he lived with his grandparents. He was raised to believe, and others were told this as well, that his mother was actually his older sister, and that his grandparents were his actual parents. So that's what Ted Bundy grew up believing for a long time. And then later in life, he actually went to kind of learn more about where he came from. And he ended up finding the public records that showed that his mother is the one who he thought was his sister. Sources kind of varied on whether this was a good environment for him or not. Some people said that he got along well with his grandparents, that they were pretty chill, just kind of, you know, standard grandparents. But other places I read said that his grandpa was racist and kind of abusive, and that his grandma was depressed, so that kind of varies as well.
You gotta do what you gotta do. You don't have to spy on people, but I said don't eat the bone.
Ow, I just bit my tongue. So much is happening. In 1950, which would have made Bundy 4 years old, he moved to Tacoma, Washington with his mom. When he was in high school, kind of middle school and high school, he started getting into a good bit of trouble. He says that he would go around drinking, and he would kind of like scour through trash cans for pornographic magazines, and he would spy on women who were like changing in their homes and things like that. So he was just kind of a creep and just kind of going around being a hoodlum. Interestingly enough, he was actually a pretty avid skier, and he was pretty good at it, but he had to steal skis in order to ski, so
He didn't have to.
well, he chose to. Do you put your eggs on the steak and eat them? Or do you eat them separately?
You can. I like to put the eggs on the hash browns and let the yolk like soak in.
Yeah. So Bundy did attend college. He started at the University of Puget Sound, and then he transferred to the University of Washington. And he went there for a little bit, but in 1968, a girlfriend of his, who he had been going out with for about a year, broke up with him. And this was kind of a pivotal moment for him, and it prompted him to begin kind of moving around. He went kind of across the U.S. He went back to Vermont, or he went back to Philadelphia. I believe he also went to Vermont, but he went back to Philadelphia as well. And in these journeys, that's where he discovered the truth about his mom and his grandparents. And eventually he did return to Washington the following year in 1969. So in 1969, Bundy re-enrolled at the University of Washington, and he was working, I almost dropped my fork. He was working towards a psychology degree. And he was also working at a suicide crisis prevention hotline. So basically one of those hotlines you can call if you're contemplating suicide and then someone talks to you. He worked at one of those. And he was pretty well regarded by his professors. He was a strong student. I believe he was an honor student. And he ended up getting accepted into a couple law schools, even though his LSAT scores were kind of mediocre. Is it the LSAT or the MCAT? The LSAT. The MCAT is like nursing school, right?
I have no idea.
So the test you have to take to get into law school, he scored like mediocre, but he had really strong letters of recommendation from his professors, so that's how he got into law school. Around this time, he started dating a woman. I believe her name is Elizabeth Klopfer. I don't think I'm pronouncing that right. I'm so sorry. So sources kind of vary on when Bundy actually started attacking and killing women. Some believe that he started as soon as his teenage years. They kind of allude to this, but I don't think it's been confirmed just because there's a lack of evidence in some of the cases that he spoke about. So the first confirmed attack that I was able to find was January 4th, 1974. January 4th is my birthday, so that's kind of unfortunate. This attack was basically, it was in Washington, and Bundy broke into a basement apartment that was occupied by an 18-year-old University of Washington student. And while she was asleep, he basically took a metal rod from her bed frame. He beat her with it until she was unconscious. He sexually assaulted her with it, and then he left. So she was...
Wait, he sexually assaulted her with the rod from the bed frame?
Yeah. So she lived, she was unconscious for 10 days, and she was left with permanent physical and mental disabilities. And soon after, I believe like a month or two after, he committed a very similar attack where he broke into an apartment and he beat a woman and then ended up leaving. So after these first two confirmed attacks, he basically began attacking women and kidnapping them and killing them. He would do about one a month throughout the year of 1974, and he would do it all around the Pacific Northwest, throughout Washington and Oregon. The police were definitely aware that there was a serial killer on the loose because all of the women that were disappearing were young white college students with a middle part. That was Bundy's preferred choice of victim. And unfortunately, there just wasn't enough physical evidence to really have a suspect in mind, so Bundy just kept on keeping on. Girls stopped hitchhiking because of this, and everyone just became super paranoid because they knew that there was someone out there hunting women, but they didn't know who it was or what his motives were or anything like that. At some point during 1974, there were a couple reported sightings of Bundy that people had noticed and kind of correlated to some of the crimes that were occurring. And there was one report of Bundy, and they described him as a young, dark-haired man who had his arm in a sling, and he was asking people, specifically women, to help him carry books back to his car, which was a tan or a brown Volkswagen Beetle. So this was pretty much all police had to go off of as far as a description. He was very bold in these crimes. At one point, he kidnapped a woman from an alleyway, and he ended up returning to the scene the morning after during a crime scene investigation, and he was able to take her earrings and one of her shoes that had been left at the crime scene, and no one noticed. So during this time, Bundy was still working and living kind of a double life. He was working first at the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Commission. That is a long name. I'm glad I remembered that. And then he was working at the Department of Emergency Services. And while he worked there, he met Carol Ann Boone, who he later became romantically involved with. And she's going to be a significant player in this story as well. So everything kind of came to a head with these kidnappings and killings when Bundy managed to kidnap 2 young women from a beach in Issaquah, Washington in broad daylight. Thankfully, because this was broad daylight, several people noticed him and were able to describe him to the police. So they put out a composite sketch. And they were getting hundreds of tips a day based on this sketch. But several people called in and named Bundy by name, including Elizabeth Clover. She saw the sketch and she recognized him and she called the police to report him. And the police looked into him, but they saw that he was, in law school and he had good grades and he was working for the community and he didn't have an adult criminal record, so they just kind of wrote it off and they said, no, he doesn't fit the profile. He's not someone who would commit these crimes. Later in 1974, Bundy ended up moving to Salt Lake City for law school. And after he moved there, he started committing more killings throughout the Utah area as well. So one of the creepy things that Bundy would do is, after he would usually rape and then kill these women, he would revisit their remains. Sometimes he would drive hundreds of miles to come back and revisit the bodies of these women that he had killed. And sometimes after he killed them, he would go as far as shampooing their hair and applying makeup to them. Throughout this whole ordeal, Elizabeth Clover was still talking with him and maintaining a relationship with him. It kind of varied between romantic and platonic, but they were almost always in communication. At one point, they even discussed getting married, which is interesting. But Clover did end up reporting Bundy 2 more times to the police in 1974. In November of 1974, Bundy tried to kidnap a woman named Carol DeRanch, and he tried to kidnap her by posing as a police officer, and he pulled her over, and then when he went to try to handcuff her, he ended up handcuffing the same hand somehow, so she was able to run away. And she reported it to the police, but he just kind of flew under the radar and kept doing his thing, going around and murdering women. On August 16th, 1975, Bundy was pulled over. He had been kind of cruising around this one area in a suburb of Salt Lake City, kind of looking for women, and a patrol car spotted him, thought it was suspicious, and started to follow him. Bundy got really freaked out and tried to flee the scene, and the cop ended up pulling him over. Inside the car, they found a ski mask, trash bags, an ice pick, another mask made from pantyhose, and they were like, this is suspicious, but Bundy tried to write it off as oh, I ski, and the rest of it is just household stuff, so it's not a big deal. The police ended up searching his apartment, and they found some other suspicious items there as well, including a guide to Colorado ski resorts and Utah ski resorts. And remember, Bundy was a fan of skiing, and he did actually kidnap several women from ski resorts, so that was suspicious. And then they also found a brochure for a play at a high school where he had also kidnapped one of his victims. So despite this kind of incriminating evidence, they didn't have enough to charge him with anything, so they ended up having to let him go. So in September, Bundy ended up selling his car to a teenager, I believe, and the car ended up getting impounded by the police. So they searched it, and they did find several hairs that ended up matching some of his victims, which was pretty incriminating. So they were able to bring him in kind of for questioning, and Carol DeRanch, the woman who had escaped his kidnapping attempt earlier, was able to pick him out from a lineup as the police officer who pulled her over. So Bundy was arrested, but his bail was set at $15,000, which his family ended up paying. So he got out of jail, and he ended up going back to Washington, where he began living with Elizabeth Clover. So in February of 1976, Bundy was found guilty of assault and attempted kidnapping. I just spit. Ew. So he was arrested, he was found guilty, and he was sentenced to 1 to 15 years in Utah State Prison. So, after he had been in prison for a little while, they ended up finding him hiding in the bushes of the prison yard with a escape kit that had like maps and a fake social security card and things like that. So they obviously took that away and they put him in solitary confinement for several weeks. So, on June 7th, 1977, Bundy was transferred to the Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen, Colorado, for a preliminary hearing. So, he elected to be his own defense attorney, which means that throughout the trial, he didn't have to wear shackles or handcuffs. So the hearing was underway, and during recess, he asked if he could go to the library in the courthouse to review some of their books and things like that. And while he was in the library, he managed to hide from the guards behind a bookcase, open a window, jump from the second story of the courthouse. He injured his ankle, but he was basically able to take off the clothes he was wearing and change into something else and escape. He made his way towards Aspen Mountain, and he ended up breaking into a hunting cabin where he stole some clothes, some food, and a rifle. And he got lost. So he basically just ended up wandering around the forest for a couple days. And then he ended up going back to town. And after 6 days of being a fugitive, he had stolen a car and was driving it. And because he was so exhausted, he was kind of out of it. And he started weaving in and out of his lane. So he ended up getting pulled over and put back in jail. So Bundy was put back in prison, but he almost immediately devised another plan to escape. So he kind of formulated this plan over a couple months while people helped smuggle him supplies. And one of the main people who did this was Carol Ann Boone. If you remember, that she was the woman who he worked with at the Department of Emergency Services, and they kind of began, getting involved. So he got a bunch of supplies, and basically in the evenings when all the other prisoners were showering, he would file at the bars in his jail cell, and he had lost like 30 pounds, so he was able to slip between the bars and get out of his cell. He tried this several times to make sure that he could actually escape, and then on December 23rd, 1977, he escaped again. Bundy stole a car, and he started driving on I-70. The car broke down in the mountains, so he ended up hitchhiking to Vail, Colorado. From there, he took a bus to Denver, Colorado. In Denver, he boarded a flight to Chicago, and it was at this point that the jail prison guards finally realized he was missing. They didn't notice until the morning after he escaped, when he was already on a plane to Chicago. So he landed in Chicago. He took a train to Ann Arbor, Michigan. He stole a car and drove to Atlanta, Georgia. And then he boarded a bus to Tallahassee, Florida. So on January 15th, 1978, Bundy broke into the Chi Omega sorority house, which was a sorority of Florida State University. So he broke into the house and he kind of went from room to room, attacking some of the girls in the house. And he was incredibly brutal. He beat them with various objects. He sexually assaulted them. And he did all of this within 15 minutes. The crazy thing is that this crime took place within earshot of about 30 witnesses, but no one heard it. So it basically went unreported until the girls were discovered. And then after leaving the sorority house, he went like a couple blocks down and he ended up breaking into the basement apartment of another woman who was a recent graduate of Florida State University, and he attacked her as well, to the point where her jaw and skull were fractured in 5 places, and she was left permanently deaf, which actually ended a dance career because she was a dancer, which is really, really sad. So following these attacks on February 8th, Bundy stole a FSU van, and he ended up driving that to Jacksonville, and he was kind of driving throughout this area in Florida. On February 15th, Bundy ended up getting pulled over by a Pensacola police officer who noticed that the car he was driving was stolen. So once Bundy realized that he was going to be arrested, he tried to take the police officer's gun and escape, and they had a struggle, but the cop ended up getting the gun back and arresting Bundy, and he was taken to the police station. In the car that Bundy had stolen, the police officer also ended up finding like 21 stolen credit cards and some IDs of FSU female students, which looked very suspicious. So in June of 1979, Bundy stood trial for the Chi Omega attacks. So Bundy had lawyers, but he decided that he wanted to basically be his own defense attorney. He wanted to kind of take the lead. And a lot of people have said that he kind of screwed himself over by doing this because he so wanted to be in control and have power over the situation that he basically just decided he wanted, to be his own defense attorney instead of taking the advice and counsel of much more experienced attorneys. On July 24th of 1979, Bundy ended up being convicted of burglary and several attempted murder charges. 6 months after Bundy was convicted of burglary and attempted murder, he stood trial for a second case in Orlando on separate charges. So, interestingly, during the penalty phase of this trial, he decided to act on this obscure law that Florida had, where if you got married in front of a court-appointed judge, then you were officially married, kind of thing. It was very obscure, it was very random, but basically they had brought Carol Ann Boone in for questioning during this trial, and while Bundy was questioning her, because remember he was his own defense attorney, he asked her, "Will you marry me?" And she said yes, and because they were in a courthouse and there was a judge, they were technically married. And Bundy kind of used this to emotionally manipulate Boone and kind of, keep her loyalty, and probably also to try to show other people, look, I'm a good guy, I have a wife, I have other priorities, this is just a big misunderstanding. But it was very random. It's also important to note that his trial was the first to be nationally televised in America. So there was tons of press coverage on this thing. I think that's one of the main reasons that he is as infamous as he is today, is because everyone knew his face, everyone watched the trial, and that kind of set the tone for how lots of future criminal trials would play out because the press plays such a big role in them to this day. On January 10th, 1980, Bundy was sentenced to death by electrocution, and this was actually his third death sentence because he had received death sentences for the other crimes as well. So he was sentenced to death. About a year later, in October of 1981, Carol Ann Boone gave birth to a daughter, and she named Bundy as the father. So at the prison where he was being held, conjugal visits were not allowed. But it was kind of known that inmates liked to pool their money, and they would basically use this to bribe the prison guards to give them alone time when they had visitors. So that's how people think that she ended up getting pregnant by Bundy during this time. So it was around this time that Bundy probably realized he was most likely going to be executed, that he started confessing to a lot of these crimes and divulging some details that was going to eventually help people locate bodies and attribute him to different crimes that they at first couldn't pin to him specifically. So he talked a lot about how he felt a need to possess women, and this is why he ended up killing them, is because that was kind of the ultimate possession in his mind, was just being able to have total control over them and just take their life away from them. In July of 1984, while Bundy was in prison, he had kind of come up with another escape plan where he was going to file at the bars in his cell, and then he glued them back together with an adhesive made out of soap. But the guards discovered this, so they put a stop to that. And he was pretty busy when he was in jail. He was confessing to a bunch of these crimes and giving details. And he was a pen pal with another criminal, John Hinckley Jr., and he was responsible for trying to assassinate Ronald Reagan at one point. So he ended up getting in trouble for being pen pals with this guy, because I don't think criminals are allowed to speak to each other via mail when you're in prison. And then he also ended up contacting a detective who was trying to work on the Gary Ridgway serial killer case. And Gary Ridgway was a prolific serial killer in the Pacific Northwest as well. So Bundy basically reached out to this detective and he was like, hey, I've been killing women for years. I know what it's like. So why don't I help you, divulge some of my information and you'll be able to catch Gary Ridgway. So they kind of had a correspondence, and these conversations have been published. There's a book out that kind of details this whole story. But basically his advice was useless because Gary Ridgway ended up committing crimes for like 15 more years after this. So Bundy's help was basically useless. Bundy's execution date was eventually set for March of 1986, but it was rescheduled to July. And then several hours before he was set to be executed, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals ended up pausing the execution because they were reviewing a former trial of his, and they had some questions about some of the circumstances surrounding it. So his execution was rescheduled while they investigated. And it was rescheduled several times for various reasons, but it ended up being firmly set for January 24th of 1989. So once this execution date was pretty firmly set, Bundy kind of got desperate. He basically began confessing to more and more crimes and murders and giving as many details as he could because he kind of just wanted to give himself more time. And the interesting thing is that though he confessed to these crimes, I read that he confessed to them in the third person and that he really just didn't take responsibility for these crimes. So even though he said like, yeah, I did this, he blamed pretty much everyone but himself for the crimes occurring. He said that it happened because his father was absent, he had a broken family, he had too much exposure to media, he had too much exposure to porn, all kinds of stuff. So as Bundy's execution date grew closer and closer, Carol Ann Boone, the mother of his child, who had moved to Florida to be close to him during the trial, ended up basically breaking things off with him because once Bundy started confessing to these murders, she felt betrayed because all along she had kind of maintained his innocence. And even though she got a little in over her head and she did a lot of crazy things, she really did believe that he was innocent. But after he started confessing to everything, she basically took his daughter and moved back to Washington to raise her away from Bundy. In kind of a last-ditch effort to push off the execution, Bundy actually ended up convincing an attorney, who some believe was a love interest of his, to reach out to the families of some of his victims and ask them to sign something basically saying that they wanted his execution to be postponed so that he could provide more information about the deaths of their loved ones. The families all denied this because they were basically under the belief that, the person we love is dead, Ted Bundy is responsible, we want to see him executed. On January 24th, 1989, Ted Bundy was offered this lovely meal that we shared today, and he reportedly didn't eat any of it. But then at 7:16 a.m., he was executed by electric chair. I still almost said electrocuted. He was electrocuted. He died in the electric chair. So his ashes were cremated in Gainesville, Florida, and they were spread at an undisclosed location in the Cascade Mountain Range of Washington. I have been to the Cascade Mountains, so maybe we were at the spot where Ted Bundy's ashes were scattered.
You know who spread his ashes? Like,
No.
was it a request by a family
I think
member?
a family member. So that is the story of Ted Bundy. Since his death, he has become a pretty iconic serial killer because he really just didn't fit the mold of what people associated with serial killers. He was young, he was attractive, he was pretty successful, he could have had a normal life ahead of him, but he committed these heinous crimes, and it was just really shocking for people because he just didn't look like someone who was capable of doing those things. In the past couple of years, Netflix actually made a movie about Ted Bundy that was called Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil and Vile. I hate that title, it's so hard for me to remember. But this starred Zac Efron as Ted Bundy and Lily Collins as Elizabeth Clover. And the film was pretty accurate to his story. They did change certain aspects of it. But the movie's pretty good. It's very interesting if you want to kind of get more perspective on the case. And Ted Bundy is still one of the most well-known serial killers to this day. The title of that movie, Extremely Wicked and Shockingly Evil and Vile, is actually what one of the judges said about Bundy at one of his trials. So they took that and used it for the title, which is pretty cool. But yeah, that has been the story of Ted Bundy, serial killer. I think this was a really interesting episode to kick off Morbid Morsels. The meal was pretty tasty. My coffee has now gone cold and my milk has warmed, so I'm just going to dump those. I'm not going to drink all of them, but my orange juice is still delicious, so that's good. Thank you guys so much for joining me and sharing this last meal with me. Again, if you like this video, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know who you want to see next on Morbid Morsels, what case you want me to cover, and I will see you guys in the next episode.